My name is Arlen Hopkins. I turned 76 this past November. Though my body insists it's older, and my mind, on occasion, still feels like it's somewhere in its 50s, stuck between memories of lecture halls and family cookouts that now seem like events from someone else's life. I live alone in the same house where my wife, Mabel, and I spent most of our marriage, a narrow 2-story colonial in Litchfield County, Connecticut, surrounded by tall pine trees and silence. It used to be warm once, lively. Now the quiet hums like a presence. It's not loneliness exactly. It's more like being the last person awake at a party that everyone else left years ago. Mabel passed away 6 years ago this January. She had a stroke while I was out buying groceries, just a loaf of rye bread and a jar of the orange marmalade she always liked on toast. When I came back, she was lying on the kitchen floor. The way her arm was stretched out toward the cupboard still visits me in my dreams. The ambulance came in 6 minutes. She was gone before they got her to the hospital. There were no last words, no long bedside goodbye, just silence and an unfinished breakfast plate, and then, a long afterward, we had one son, Trevor. He was the pride of our early years, bright, quick, handsome in the way Mabel always said reminded her of Gregory Peck. He had a laugh that used to light up a room, and he was the kind of boy who would bring home injured birds, try to fix old radios, read whole encyclopedias in the summer. I thought he'd become a professor or maybe an engineer like my father. Instead, he went into real estate, chasing commissions and bigger houses, and somewhere along the line, the sparkle turned into something harder, something sharp. When Mabel died, Trevor couldn't make it to the funeral. He was closing a deal in Tampa that couldn't wait, though he sent flowers and a card that I've kept. Out of habit more than sentiment. He came by 2 weeks later, stayed for 48 minutes, and asked if I had any plans to sell the house now that I was alone. I remember the way he phrased it. "We're just worried about you being here by yourself, Dad. Big house, lots of stairs. What if you fall?" He didn't ask about the mornings, how I kept burning the coffee, or how I sometimes stood in the pantry wondering what I'd come in for. He didn't ask if I ate regularly or how I was sleeping. He asked about property taxes and whether I still had access to Mabel's life insurance account. I told him I wasn't ready to leave the house yet. He didn't argue. He just nodded, the way people do when they've already made other plans. I've had only a handful of visitors since then. The mailman waves. A woman named Trudy from the church drops off canned goods every Thanksgiving, even though I told her once that I'm not religious anymore. Sometimes one of my old students, a quiet boy named Danny, who's now grown with children of his own, stops by to bring me pastries and tell me I was his favorite teacher. He teaches middle school history now. That always makes me feel strange. Proud, but also like I've become a footnote in someone else's legacy. Trevor and I kept in touch, nominally. Birthdays, the occasional call around tax season. 2 years ago, he asked for a loan, $25,000 to cover a temporary liquidity issue in one of his projects. He assured me it would be returned within 6 months. With interest, Dad, of course. I never saw a cent. When I followed up, he stopped returning calls for a while. Then came another request. This time, it was for legal fees. Something about a zoning dispute. I gave him $10,000. Then, nothing for nearly a year. I told myself that's just how it goes now. Children grow up. They become their own people. You can't expect them to orbit your world forever. And yet, every December, I would put up the same cardboard and plastic nativity set that Mabel loved, with the chipped wise man and the headless camel she insisted we keep anyway. I'd leave the porch light on longer than usual, just in case someone stopped by. No one ever did. Last year, I had a Christmas dinner of canned yams and instant stuffing. I didn't even put on music. It felt like performing for an audience that had already left the theater. Then this year, on December 18th, I got a call. It was Trevor. His voice was bright, too bright, like a man calling a customer, not a father. "Hey, Pops, you doing anything for Christmas this year?" I sat down, slowly, unsure what to make of it. "I was thinking of staying in," I said. "Maybe watch the Charlie Brown special." "Why?" "Well," he said, "Rachel and I were talking, and we thought it's been too long. We'd love to have you come out, spend the holiday with us. The kids would love it." I didn't even know what to say. Trevor inviting me? After all this time? I should have asked questions. I should have wondered what had changed. But all I felt in that moment was relief. Warm, irrational relief. "That sounds wonderful," I said. He gave me the address. A house upstate about an hour and a half away. A rental, he said, just for the holiday. Big fireplace, great kitchen, snow on the trees. Real cozy. I tried to picture it. A family gathered around a fire, presents, laughter, the way Mabel used to imagine Christmas would be when we were older and the world gentler. I packed the next day. I ironed the one suit I still owned. I baked oatmeal cookies from her old recipe. I even dug out the carved wooden reindeer Trevor had made when he was 10. Crooked, with a cracked antler, but full of effort. Mabel had always said it was the most beautiful thing on our tree. On Christmas Eve morning, Trevor picked me up. He was driving a black SUV I didn't recognize. His smile was wide, his coat expensive. Rachel was in the passenger seat, perfectly made up. Her phone in hand, she gave me a brief, polite hello. The kids, 2 of them, I'd been told, weren't there. "They're already up at the house," Trevor said. "We're doing a little surprise thing. You'll love it." I nodded, holding the tin of cookies awkwardly in my lap. As we drove, I watched the snow-covered trees blur past, feeling something twist in my gut that I couldn't quite name. I told myself it was nerves, or maybe excitement. Maybe this year would be different. Maybe there would be music, a fire, warm food. Maybe Trevor had remembered that he still had a father, and maybe he wanted to rebuild something before it was too late. Maybe, just maybe, this would be a Christmas worth remembering. But I didn't yet know I'd be spending it alone, locked in the attic. We arrived at the house around 4 in the afternoon. Snow had already begun to fall again, not thick but steady. Soft flakes descending like little parachutes onto the winding driveway. The place was impressive, too impressive. 3 stories tall, glass front, all sharp lines and sterile landscaping. Perched like a monument on a hill surrounded by trees that had been cut too evenly to be natural. It didn't feel like a home. It felt like something from a magazine, A rental designed to impress someone, maybe a client or a mistress, not a family gathering place. Trevor pulled into the circular drive and cut the engine. "Here we are," he said cheerfully, opening his door. I moved slower, stiff from the long ride, my knees aching from the cold. Rachel had already disappeared through the front door by the time I stepped out onto the crunching gravel, the tin of cookies still clutched in my hands. "Let me get that," Trevor said, reaching for my suitcase. But he didn't wait for an answer before grabbing it and heading up the steps. Inside, the house was warm, but not welcoming. Clean, elegant, minimalist, the kind of place that doesn't tolerate fingerprints or laughter. No sign of children, no sign of stockings, no smell of cinnamon or pine. The Christmas tree in the corner was artificial and perfectly decorated in white and silver. It looked like it had been ordered online along with the house. I stood there awkwardly for a moment before Trevor gestured toward a narrow hallway. "Your room's just down there, first door on the left," he said. "We figured you'd want your own space to rest." I nodded, though I hadn't said anything of the kind. The room was small, with a single bed and no decorations. A folded towel on the pillow, like in a hotel. I set the tin of cookies on the dresser and sat down slowly, listening for signs of life. Children's laughter, music, the soft hum of conversation. But all I heard was the faint click of Rachel's heels, somewhere upstairs, and the opening and closing of kitchen drawers. After a few minutes, I wandered back out to the living room, where Trevor was standing by the fireplace with his phone. He looked up and smiled in that overly bright way again. "Hungry? We've got dinner soon. Just waiting on one of Rachel's friends to arrive. She's helping with dessert." "Where are the kids?" I asked, trying to keep my voice light. "I thought they'd be excited to see Grandpa." He glanced at me, then quickly away. "Oh, right. So, they're spending the night at their mom's, from Rachel's first marriage. Complicated schedule this year, but we'll FaceTime them later. They'll be thrilled to say hi." He smiled again, but it didn't reach his eyes. Something about the way he avoided my gaze made my stomach tighten. I tried to shake it off. Dinner was served around 6. A strangely formal meal, considering it was just the three of us and the mysterious dessert friend, who never arrived. Roast beef, steamed asparagus, mashed potatoes that tasted like they'd come from a box. Rachel poured wine, but didn't drink it. Trevor told a story about a client who tried to buy a second home using Monopoly money as a joke. I smiled politely. I offered my cookies after the meal, and they were politely ignored. That night I sat in the guest room and stared at the ceiling, listening to the creak of footsteps above me and the occasional murmur of voices I couldn't quite make out. I wondered again about the kids, if they even knew I was here, if they knew who I was at all. I looked at my phone. No messages. I hadn't told anyone where I was going. It struck me for the first time in a long time how utterly alone I really was. I turned out the light. The next morning, I woke early. Old habit. The house was silent. I crept down the hall, trying to be quiet, unsure whether I was allowed to use the kitchen. When I opened the fridge, it was nearly empty. A half-used bottle of almond milk, 3 diet sodas, a container of hummus. No breakfast food, no eggs, no bacon, not even cereal. I poured a glass of tap water and sat at the kitchen island staring at the blinking red light on the thermostat. The silence felt different that morning. not peaceful, watchful. Around 9, Trevor came downstairs in gym clothes, his hair tousled. "Hey, Pops, sleep okay?" "Well enough," I said. "Where's Rachel?" "She had a thing. Charity event. Back this afternoon." He poured himself a smoothie from a pitcher I hadn't noticed. "Hey, can I ask a favor? The plumber's supposed to come check a pipe in the basement, and we need to keep that area clear. Would you mind moving upstairs for a couple nights? There's a finished attic. Heat, windows, nice setup. You'll have more privacy up there anyway. It's a little tight down here." I stared at him. Something about the way he said it didn't sit right. "If you need the space, I suppose," I said. "Is it many stairs?" "Just one flight. I'll carry your bag." He was already moving before I could answer. I followed him up a narrow staircase at the end of the hallway, past a closed door I hadn't seen before. At the top was a small landing, a heavy wooden door, and beyond it, the attic. It was warmer than I expected, with a small twin bed pushed into the corner, a dresser, a dusty skylight. No decorations, no clock. A small space heater hummed in the corner. "Just temporary," Trevor said, setting my bag down. "We'll figure out something more comfortable tomorrow. Let me know if you need anything." He stepped back through the door. I nodded, then turned to look at the room. When I turned back, the door was already closed. I waited for the sound of retreating footsteps, but none came. I stepped toward the door and tried the handle. It didn't budge. It was locked. From the outside, I knocked, called out, waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder. Still silence. I checked the windows. They were latched tight and frosted over. The small skylight was too narrow to crawl through. I sat down on the edge of the bed, suddenly very still. That was the moment I realized something was very wrong. I sat there for a long time, not moving, as if by staying still, I could somehow undo whatever had just happened. I told myself it was a mistake. Maybe the latch had caught accidentally. Maybe Trevor didn't realize it had locked behind him. I knocked again, softer this time, half hoping I'd hear his voice laughing at the misunderstanding. Nothing. I waited, listening. The heater buzzed faintly in the corner. Beyond that, silence. No footsteps, no voices, not even the hum of conversation from below. It was as if the house had emptied itself out the moment I'd been sealed away. I stood, approached the door again, and twisted the handle with more force. It didn't budge, not even a rattle of give. The door was thick, old, and solid, the kind of craftsmanship that keeps the cold out in winter and people in when they're not meant to leave. The attic itself was tidy, but sparse. There was the bed, neatly made with a synthetic blanket, and a pillow still stiff from disuse, a wooden dresser, the kind you find in a cheap motel, with drawers that stuck when you pulled them. A narrow window, high in the wall, offered only a view of sky, smudged and gray behind the glass. There were no books, no lamp, no phone. I had my cell in my pocket, but when I pulled it out, the screen showed no signal, just a mocking red bar and a drained battery warning. Of course. This far out, in the woods, signal was never reliable, and I'd forgotten to charge it the night before. I pressed the power button anyway. Nothing. I tried knocking again, louder now. I shouted. I listened. Still nothing. I tried banging on the door with my fist, with my shoe, even with the leg of the chair tucked under the desk. It only echoed dully, absorbed by thick wood and a silent house. Panic, real and icy, began to creep into my chest. I had no watch, no way of measuring time, only the fading light from the skylight as the afternoon began to settle into early evening. I tried to focus, think. If this was an accident, someone would come eventually. Maybe Rachel would return and ask where I was. Maybe Trevor would realize the door had jammed and let me out. Maybe they were just downstairs, unaware. But as the hours passed, I began to accept the truth that had been circling just outside my mind like a moth near a porch light. I wasn't stuck. I was put here on purpose, and they weren't coming back. The temperature began to dip. The heater did its best, but the corners of the attic held on to cold like a memory. I pulled the blanket from the bed and wrapped it around my shoulders, sat down and tried to collect my thoughts. Why would Trevor do this? Was it some cruel joke? Some test of patience, of character, a punishment for something, for refusing to sign over the house, for the money he still owed? It didn't feel like punishment. It felt like removal, like I'd been placed out of sight so that something else could happen without me in the way. I thought back to the ride up, to the empty house, to the absence of decorations or warmth. I thought about the story of the children being with their mother, about Rachel's quiet tension, about the lack of gifts, of preparation, of even the bare minimum gestures of family celebration. None of it added up. And then I remembered something, a moment in the car, when I'd reached for my wallet at the gas station, only to find Trevor had already paid. I hadn't touched my wallet since then. I stood quickly, opened my suitcase, and began to search. At first, everything looked normal. My clothes were folded, my toiletries neatly packed. But when I reached the inner zipper where I always kept my small leather wallet, my fingers touched only fabric. It was gone. I dug deeper, turned everything out onto the bed. Still nothing. I checked my coat, the pockets of the pants I'd worn the day before, gone. My passport, credit card, emergency cash, all missing. And now, the cold panic shifted into something else. Dread. Not only was I locked away, I'd been stripped of any means of independence, of identity, of escape. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat awake on the edge of the bed, wrapped in the scratchy blanket, listening for any sound, any sign of life from below. Once, around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps, faint and hesitant, but they never came near. I called out. No reply. I waited, heart pounding, but the house remained mute. The heater buzzed on, then off, its cycles the only rhythm in the hours that followed. Hunger gnawed at me. I hadn't eaten since the night before. My mouth was dry. There was no water in the room, and no bathroom. I checked the corners for something, anything, and found only a plastic wastebasket and a musty trunk with nothing inside but a moth-eaten quilt. Morning came slowly. The gray light through the skylight brightened, and with it, a horrible clarity. This wasn't an accident. This was something else entirely, something calculated. I approached the door again and pounded, called out, begged. I shouted Trevor's name, Rachel's. No answer. I sank to the floor, heart hammering. My knees ached. My throat burned. My thoughts churned with every possible reason, every possible mistake I might have made to deserve this. But then something unexpected happened. I heard voices, muffled, indistinct, but definitely human. Someone was below me. I pressed my ear to the floor, the boards cold against my skin, and strained to hear. It was Trevor. I couldn't make out the whole conversation, but snippets drifted up between the gaps in the floorboards. Just for a few more days. Paperwork isn't finalized. He doesn't even know. Once it's done, we'll figure something out. And then silence again. I pulled away from the floor, hands shaking. What paperwork? What didn't I know? My thoughts raced. Was he trying to sell something? The house? My house? The insurance policy? Had he faked a signature? Taken my information? I remembered the old joint account we'd opened when Mabel was still alive, the one I never closed. I remembered the power of attorney form he'd once brought up casually, months after Mabel's funeral. Just in case something happens to you, Dad, you don't want to be stuck with no one to help you out, right? I'd refused then. Had he found another way? The implications were suffocating. Whatever he was doing, I wasn't meant to know. And I certainly wasn't meant to interfere. I stood again, suddenly restless. I needed to do something. Anything. I pulled open the old trunk again and reached behind it. Dust, cobwebs, and then something hard. A metal box wedged behind the beams. I dragged it out and pried it open. Inside was a tangled mess of cords, an old battery-powered radio, the kind I hadn't seen since my days in the Army, and beneath it, a coiled wire and a cracked pair of headphones. I turned it over in my hands. It looked dead, but maybe, just maybe, I found the battery compartment, 2 D cells inside, corroded but intact. I scratched away the white crust, blew out the dust, and flipped the switch. A faint crackle. Hope surged. I fiddled with the dial, searching for a frequency, any frequency, static. More static, then a brief flicker of voice. Weather report, maybe. I adjusted the antenna, moved to the window, held my breath. More static. Then something clearer. A man's voice, repeating a station ID. I pressed the talk button, if that's what it was. "This is Arlen Hopkins," I said, my voice rough, hoarse. "I'm in a house near Litchfield. I'm locked in an attic. Please, someone, can you hear me?" Nothing. I tried again. Then a voice crackled back, faint, young. "Say again? Did you say locked?" My hands trembled. "Yes, I'm locked in. My son locked me in the attic. I need help." The line went dead for a moment. Then the voice returned. "Sir, I think you're on the emergency frequency. I'm just a ham operator in New Jersey, but I'm going to call someone, okay? Can you stay put?" I laughed, a dry, brittle thing. "I don't have much choice," I said. And then, for the first time in 36 hours, I felt something shift inside me. Not fear, not despair, but the first flicker of resolve. They thought they'd hidden me. They thought I was isolated, helpless, gone. But I was still here, still breathing. And someone, somewhere, had heard me. The hours that followed were blurred at the edges, suspended between hope and dread. After that voice over the radio, young, shaky, but determined, I knew the situation had changed. I was no longer alone in a locked attic. I had spoken to someone. Someone knew I existed. And yet, with every minute that passed in silence, that small spark of hope was crowded by doubts. What if it was a prank? What if the connection had failed and my call for help had gone nowhere? What if they found the radio and smashed it to pieces before anyone arrived? I tucked the device beneath the bed, wrapped in the old quilt to muffle any hums or accidental crackles. Then I waited. I counted the seconds in my head the way I used to count off minutes in detention halls when the kids were too loud and time seemed endless. The silence of the attic thickened, became a pressure behind my eyes. I watched the sky change colors. Through the dusty skylight, slate gray to bruised blue, then finally to ink. And then, sometime in the darkness, I heard it, the thump of a car door. I moved quickly to the tiny window and pressed my face against the cold glass. Below, the driveway lit up faintly with red and blue flashes, distant, reflected, but unmistakable. Then voices, sharp, clipped, authoritative. I pressed my ear to the door but couldn't make out the words. Movement followed. Hurried, confused, the scraping of furniture or boxes being shifted downstairs. Trevor's voice, raised in something that was either surprise or defense. Then another voice, older, calmer, saying something I couldn't hear. I didn't call out. I don't know why. Maybe I was afraid it wasn't real. Maybe I was afraid that if I made noise, they'd have time to hide whatever it was they were doing. I just stood still, heart pounding like a hammer against my ribs. Minutes passed. Then steps, heavy and confident, came up the stairs. A key in the lock, a turning of metal. The door opened. Bright light spilled in, momentarily blinding me. A man in uniform stepped inside, tall, gray at the temples, his mouth a thin, grim line. He looked at me for a moment, at the blanket still wrapped around my shoulders, the dried blood on my knuckles, from beating the door the night before, the radio peeking from under the bed. "Mr. Hopkins?" he asked. "Are you all right?" I nodded but couldn't speak. My throat closed. The words wouldn't come. "We've been contacted by a ham radio operator," he continued. "Said he got a distress signal. I'm Officer Carrington. You're safe now." I didn't feel safe. Not yet. But I stepped forward. Behind him, in the hall, I caught a glimpse of Trevor. Pale, furious, mouth opening and closing like a man who had forgotten how to lie fast enough. Rachel stood next to him, arms folded, her expression flat. The moment our eyes met, she looked away. Your son says this is all a misunderstanding, Carrington said carefully, leading me down the stairs. He says the door jammed, that you insisted on staying in the attic for privacy, that you're forgetful. I laughed then, not because it was funny. It wasn't. It was the brittle, exhausted laugh of a man who realized that his own flesh and blood had rehearsed a version of reality where he was no longer credible. I looked at the officer. He took my wallet, my ID, locked the door from the outside. I haven't eaten since yesterday. Tell me, do I look like I forgot that on purpose? Carrington didn't answer, but I saw the flicker in his eyes, the doubt, the calculation, the slow realization that the story he'd been told wasn't holding water. He took a statement, a brief one, promised to file a report. You'll want to speak to a lawyer, he said. If there are documents involved, financials, any suggestion that someone's tried to claim assets under your name. I nodded. There's a joint account, I said. He's the secondary, and Mabel's death benefit. He asked about it last year. I told him it wasn't his. We rode in silence to the nearby sheriff's station, where they gave me coffee, dry clothes, and a place to sit while I tried to remember passwords, phone numbers, connections to the outside world. My phone, still dead. My access to any digital service, email, online banking, disabled without my ID. I felt like a ghost in my own life. That night, alone in a dim room, with a cot and a flickering wall heater, I asked for a piece of paper and a pen. I began to write down everything I remembered. Conversations, phrases, dates, the names of bank managers, lawyers, even the day Trevor had last asked for money. Not because anyone told me to, but because I knew deep in the gut instinct that comes from being a teacher, a husband, and a father, that I was up against something bigger than one bad son. Trevor hadn't just tried to get rid of me. He'd tried to erase me. And now, for the first time in years, I understood that I needed to fight. Not for the money, not even for justice, but to reclaim the one thing he thought I'd already lost, my dignity. The days that followed moved with a strange rhythm, as if time itself were unsure whether to crawl or sprint. I remained at the small sheriff's station while arrangements were made. A temporary phone was issued to me. A social worker brought in to help verify my identity, and a local nonprofit provided me with clothing that didn't itch and a warm place to sleep while my situation was evaluated. That's the word they kept using, evaluated, as if I were a used car or an expired license, something to be checked for rust and dents before they decided whether I was still roadworthy. I didn't complain. After the attic, a cot with clean sheets and a door that opened from the inside felt like a luxury resort. They asked me to recount everything. How I'd gotten there, how long I'd been in the attic, what I remembered about the house, my son, any paperwork. I told them the truth, plain and calm. I didn't add color or dramatics. I didn't need to. The facts were damning enough. I explained how Trevor had gradually distanced himself over the years, how our contact dwindled to loan requests, how I'd given him tens of thousands of dollars without question because I still believed, somehow, that blood was thicker than disappointment. I told him about the joint account, the missing documents, the time he suggested I give him power of attorney just in case. I saw the expressions on their faces shift from polite skepticism to grim understanding. One officer, a younger man with dark, tired eyes, shook his head and said quietly, "You wouldn't believe how often this happens." The social worker, a woman named Bethany who wore kindness like armor, asked if I had any family I could stay with. I laughed harder than I meant to. "My family locked me in an attic for Christmas," I said. "I think that's off the table." She gave me a long look and said she'd help me make arrangements, but first they needed to know what Trevor had been doing. That meant tracing financial activity, checking on the house deed, seeing if any documents had been filed in my name. I gave them permission to access everything. If Trevor had touched something that wasn't his, I wanted it exposed. A few days later, Officer Carrington returned, carrying a folder thicker than a Bible and twice as damning. He didn't sit when he spoke. He stood across the room, holding the file like it might catch fire if he let it rest too long. "Mr. Hopkins," he said, "you were right to come forward. Your son has been busy." What followed was a quiet, methodical unspooling of betrayal. Trevor had not only accessed our joint account, he had moved over $60,000 from it over the past 18 months, most of it under vague payment descriptions, legal. Fees, consultation, property review. Worse, he had presented a signed affidavit, forged, we suspected, that granted him partial control over my personal bank account and had attempted to initiate a funds transfer days before Christmas. It had been blocked only due to a clerical inconsistency. The bank flagged it, Carrington said, but they never followed up. They assumed it was a family matter. The worst came when he pulled out the property documents. The house, Mabel's and mine, the one I'd kept in my name since the day we closed on it in 1981, had somehow been listed for sale, not officially on the open market, but within a private holding company tied to Trevor's real estate firm. "He was moving to sell it behind your back," Carrington said. "We're still investigating the paperwork trail, but there's reason to believe he planned to list it after the new year. If he'd succeeded, it might have taken months before anyone realized you hadn't consented." I listened to all of this without speaking, without blinking. Part of me had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed, seeing it in printed ink, notarized and filed, was like being told your child had died, only worse. Because this wasn't death, this was decision. He had chosen this, chosen to see me not as a father, not even as an obstacle, but as an asset to be cleared, a liability to be locked away until the ink dried. I asked if I could see the documents. Carrington handed them over. I flipped through each page slowly, forcing myself to read every line. It was all there. My signature, perfectly replicated. Witnesses who didn't exist. Dates that coincided with the week I'd been sick with bronchitis and hadn't left the house. He hadn't even needed my physical presence. All he needed was access to my records, my name, my trust. I found myself wondering how long he'd been planning this. Had it started the day Mabel died, or before? Bethany helped me file a formal complaint with the State Elder Protection Unit. She arranged for a lawyer from a legal aid foundation to meet with me the next morning. His name was Jerome Weaver, and he was the kind of man who carried a briefcase that had seen wars. He had thin, clinical lips and a mind like a scalpel. After reviewing the files and hearing my account, he nodded and said, "We'll file to freeze all accounts immediately. He can explain himself to the judge." I expected things to slow down after that, but they didn't. Within 48 hours, the courts issued a temporary injunction barring Trevor from accessing any of the shared financial resources or assets tied to my name. Notices were sent to the banks, to the brokerage accounts, to the property office. When the process server arrived at Trevor's office to deliver the restraining notice, he refused to accept it. "We'll find him again," Jerome said coolly. "Let him run. It'll only make him look worse." And then, on the 5th day, Trevor appeared. Not in person, through a lawyer. A letter arrived, dense and sanctimonious, stating that Mr. Trevor Hopkins is gravely concerned about the mental fitness of his father, Mr. Arlen Hopkins, and that he believes recent erratic behavior indicates potential cognitive decline. It stated that Trevor had attempted to initiate power of attorney out of concern for his father's well-being, and that his actions, including the relocation to the attics, were part of a temporary care strategy intended to ensure Mr. Hopkins did not wander, injure himself, or leave the premises unsupervised. I read the letter aloud in the lawyer's office. When I finished, Jerome looked at me and said, "He's going to try to flip it. Say you're unstable, that none of this is real." Bethany frowned. "Will it work?" Jerome shrugged. "If we let it. But he's made mistakes. Big ones." It felt surreal, like being trapped in someone else's lie. Trevor had spun a narrative in which I was senile, paranoid, confused, a danger to myself. I could see how it might look plausible. An old man, living alone, making accusations against his own son. There were no bruises, no visible injuries, no videos or recordings, just my word and forged paperwork. But I wasn't going to let him take more than he already had. Jerome arranged for an independent medical evaluation. 3 specialists, none of whom I had ever seen before, were scheduled to assess me for cognitive impairment. I met them over the next week, a neurologist, a psychiatrist, and a geriatric specialist. Each of them asked careful, pointed questions. Some I answered from memory, others from the notes I had written in the station, the timeline I had built for myself. When they asked why I had waited so long to come forward, I told the truth. "Because I loved him," I said, "and I didn't want to believe my own son could be capable of this." By the end of the 2nd week, the results were in. All 3 assessments concluded that I was of sound mind, fully competent to manage my affairs, and showed no signs of dementia or cognitive degradation. Jerome sent copies to the court with a motion to dismiss any guardianship claims Trevor's legal team might attempt to file. "We've got them in a corner now," he said. "He's going to panic." And panic he did. That night, I received a voicemail. Trevor's voice, half choked, half defiant. "You think you've won? You don't understand anything. This was for your own good. You can't live alone forever. You need help, even if you don't admit it." It was the voice of a man whose schemes were unraveling, who'd bet everything on a plan that was falling apart in full view of the law, But there was no apology, no regret, just anger. And in that moment, I understood something with terrible clarity. He hadn't done this out of desperation. He'd done it because he thought he could, because I had taught him over a lifetime that I would forgive anything, that I would always open the door, even after he had slammed it shut. But the door was closed now, not locked, just finally and forever shut. I didn't respond to Trevor's message. There was nothing left to say. His words didn't sting anymore, not because they were false, but because they were so predictable, so deeply rehearsed, that they no longer carried the weight of anything real. I'd spent the better part of my life forgiving things that were never apologized for. I'd spent even longer assuming silence meant understanding, and misunderstanding could be cured with patience. But now I knew better. Trevor didn't believe he had done anything wrong. He believed he had a right to do it, and that was what made everything so much worse. In the weeks that followed the court's recognition of my competency and the freezing of all compromised assets, things began to shift in ways I hadn't anticipated. Jerome filed a petition to formally reclaim any misappropriated funds from Trevor's company, citing fraudulent use of my name, forged documents, and illegal attempts to transfer ownership of my home. The evidence was overwhelming, and Trevor's lawyer, a thin, panicked man with a voice that trembled through every motion, seemed desperate to settle before formal criminal charges were filed. But I didn't want settlement. I didn't want negotiation. I wanted clarity. I wanted sunlight poured over every shadow my son had ever constructed, and so I refused to sign anything that implied closure. I wanted the process public, visible, recorded. I wanted the truth to be a matter of record, not rumor. What I didn't expect, though, was what came next. One evening, as I returned to the small apartment provided by a transitional housing program while I awaited resolution of the property case, I found a letter taped to the door. No envelope, just folded paper and handwriting I hadn't seen in years. It was from my granddaughter, Lily, Trevor's oldest, who I hadn't seen since she was 11. The handwriting was careful, almost too formal, and the message inside short. Grandpa Arlen, I heard what happened. I don't know everything, and Dad won't tell us much, but I remember you. I remember how you used to read to me in that green chair, and how you brought me rocks from your trips because I liked geology. I remember how you always had red licorice in your jacket pocket for church. I just wanted to say that I believe you, and I'm sorry. Love, Lily. I stood there for a long time, reading that single page over and over until the words blurred. That letter meant more than anything a lawyer or officer could have said. It meant something of me had remained intact in the minds of the generation I'd never had the chance to really know. It meant I hadn't disappeared completely. And yet, that note also made me more certain than ever that this wasn't just about legality. It was about memory, legacy, the truth that would survive me. The court date was set for late February. Jerome prepared me for the worst: character assassinations, attempts to undermine my credibility, baseless emotional appeals. Don't take the bait, he said. They'll try to make it look like a family squabble. This isn't a squabble. This is theft. Stay steady. When the day came, I wore the same suit I had worn to Mabel's funeral. It still hung on me, looser now, a bit dusty at the cuffs, but I wore it anyway. Not for formality, but for remembrance. She would have known exactly what to say. She would have stood beside me, silent but solid. And so, in a way, she did. Trevor showed up 15 minutes late, wearing a designer jacket and a look of careful detachment. He avoided my eyes as we passed in the corridor. He looked smaller than I remembered, not in stature, but in presence, like a photograph that had faded in the sun. Rachel wasn't with him. His lawyer looked exhausted. The proceedings began quietly, methodically. Jerome presented our evidence, the forged affidavits, the transaction records, the failed transfer attempt, the evaluations affirming my mental clarity, the radio transmission log that first alerted authorities to my situation, then the photographs of the attic. No bathroom, no food, no phone, just one door, one lock. Trevor's defense stuttered. They leaned into the concerned son narrative, citing my age, my supposed confusion, the temporary nature of my stay in the attic. At one point, they even tried to suggest that I had misinterpreted Trevor's intentions, that perhaps I had locked myself in by accident. Jerome's response was surgical. Then why was the door locked from the outside? He asked. Why was Mr. Hopkins' wallet missing? Why were there no attempts to unlock the door for nearly 2 full days, even when he was clearly unreachable? The courtroom was silent. When I took the stand, I didn't speak with anger. I spoke plainly. I told him about Mabel, about Trevor as a boy, about how families don't break in one moment, but over years, through erosion and silence and missed birthdays. I told them about the attic, about the sound of Trevor's voice drifting through the floorboards, saying, "He doesn't even know yet." And I told them what it felt like to be treated not as a father, but as an obstacle, something to be moved out of the way for convenience. I loved him, I said. I still do somewhere inside. That's what makes this worse. Not that he did this, but that he did it believing I would never stop loving him enough to stop him. I stepped down from the stand to silence. The judge called for a recess. The court would reconvene the next morning to hear closing arguments and deliver judgment. That night, I slept with the light off. First time in weeks. No dreams, just silence and the soft breath of a world that, for the first time in a long time, felt like it was turning in my favor. The ruling came the next day just after noon, and though I had prepared myself for every possible outcome, victory, delay, compromise, I was still caught off guard by how simple it all felt. The judge's voice was calm, almost indifferent, as he read the decision aloud. Full restoration of all financial access and legal ownership to me. A formal reprimand against Trevor for abuse of fiduciary authority, and a referral of the case to the State's Attorney General for review of potential criminal fraud. The court recognized the attic incident not as a misunderstanding, but as an act of unlawful confinement against a vulnerable individual driven by financial motive and executed with premeditated deceit. There was no dramatic pause. No gasp in the courtroom, just those words, quiet, steady, final, and then the sound of a gavel hitting wood like a door being gently, permanently closed. Trevor didn't look at me. Not once. As we exited the courthouse, Jerome asked if I wanted to press criminal charges personally. I told him no. He's already lost, I said. He just doesn't know it yet, but in truth, it wasn't mercy I was offering. It was distance. The man I'd once called son was now just a stranger with my last name, and I wanted no further ties to that kind of darkness. Let the state pursue what it must. I was done. Returning to my own home after all that time felt surreal. A sheriff's deputy accompanied me, not because it was necessary, but because they insisted, just in case Trevor had left behind anything dangerous or destructive. But the house was empty, quiet, nothing broken, nothing stolen, just stillness. In the kitchen, the old calendar Mabel used to keep on the fridge still hung, frozen, at December. I turned the page to January, then paused, tore the whole thing down, and threw it away. I wasn't interested in crossing off days anymore. In the days that followed, the news spread. Not widely, but enough. A local TV station did a quiet segment on elder abuse and mentioned my case, changing my name at my request. A few neighbors dropped off cards and casseroles. One woman, whom I barely knew, left a tin of cinnamon cookies on my porch with a note that said simply, "For your strength." I didn't answer the door. I didn't want to be seen as a victim or a survivor or an inspiration. I just wanted peace. Then one afternoon, the doorbell rang again. I almost didn't answer it, but something in me, maybe the ghost of who I used to be, stirred. When I opened the door, Lily was standing there. Taller now, 17, maybe 18, her hair darker, her posture cautious. In her hands was a small paper bag. "I thought you might like some red licorice," she said. Her voice shook a little. I let her in. We sat on the porch, not saying much at first. She told me that Trevor had left town, that he'd said something about rebuilding in Arizona, and that Rachel had filed for separation. She said her mother was furious, not because of the scandal, but because of the betrayal, not just against me, but against the family, the name. She says he burned something we can't get back, Lily said quietly. I didn't ask what that meant. I didn't have to. We talked for a long time. She asked about Mabel. I told her about the garden, the way she used to hum while watering the tomatoes, how she'd once slapped a raccoon with a wooden spoon for stealing strawberries. We laughed. She cried. I didn't. When she left, I walked her to the edge of the driveway. She turned and hugged me without warning. A fierce, quiet thing that reminded me that somewhere in the wreckage, something good had survived. In the months that followed, I made small changes. I repaired the porch swing. I donated the suit I wore to court. I bought a cheap ham radio set and started talking with the operator who'd helped me that night, a teenager named Marcus who lived in New Jersey and had assumed I was some sort of prank until he heard the strain in my voice. We spoke often. He asked if I'd ever taught physics. I told him I used to. He asked if I'd teach him. I said yes. I never saw Trevor again, but sometimes I walk past the attic door and touch the frame, not out of anger, but as a reminder, not of what he did, but of what I endured, not of what I lost, but of what I refused to surrender. My silence, my name, my truth. He tried to lock me away, bury me beneath the weight of his own ambition, but I came down with his secret, and I left with something better. My life, my story, my peace.